HR leaders, what's on your mind these days? Is it AI? Is it the economy? The talent market? Remote work? Retention? DEI? Pay transparency? New laws? Our 2024 Workplace Trends Report outlines how HR leaders are thinking about these challenges and what they believe will help their organizations overcome them. Want to find out what they said? Head on over to peoplemanagingpeople.com/Workplace Trends 2024 and download the report to find out.
Many organizations shifted to remote this year, and with that, working hard to figure out how to continue to bring creativity, fun, and connection to their teams. But how? If we can't meet in person, play that game of ping pong, jump into a brainstorm with a whiteboard, what do? My guest today is an expert at how companies can create and enhance a culture of creativity and play. He has worked with various companies on how to drive a culture of employee-driven initiatives with a focus on play, using the 8 play personalities. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tim Reitzma, the resident host of People Managing People. Welcome to the podcast. We're people managing people, and we want to lead and manage better. We're owners, founders, entrepreneurs, we're middle managers, we're team leaders. We're managing people, and yes, we do human resources. But we're not HR, at least not in the traditional sense. We're on a mission to help people lead and manage their teams and organizations more effectively. So if you want to lead and manage better, if you want to become a better organizational leader and more effective people manager, then join us. Keep listening to the podcast to find the tips, tricks, and tools you need to recruit, retain, manage, and lead your people and organization more effectively. And while listening to the show, please subscribe and join our mailing list on peoplemanagingpeople.com to stay up to date with all that's going on. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for joining me on the People Managing People podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and so before we jump into it, just tell our audience, tell our guests a little bit about yourself, about your consulting company and your journey into consulting. I think it would be fascinating to just start there.
Sure. So the company I run is called Playficient, and the idea that I help with organizations is helping organizations cut through the bull and focus on what really matters on the employee experience. So I mainly do that through 4 areas, one being looking beyond the ping pong table and the forced fun and creating playful workplaces, which we'll talk about today. Another is working on the employee onboarding process. Another is employee experience design through design thinking. Another one is creating employee journey maps by using the ancient old technique of storytelling. Been about in early 2018, I was at my old job, bored, listening to podcasts. And one I was listening to was called Side Hustle School. It was about creating side businesses that mostly turned into full-time businesses. There was a guy who had a fairly similar background to me as far as his work background as, a user experience designer, product manager, project manager. But he started to add and incorporate more humor into workplace presentations, and eventually he formed a company around helping organizations make use of humor in the workplace. And I reached out to him, and at the time I was doing a lot of improv comedy, so I tried it out at various events of how to use improv in the workplace to improve communication and teamwork. Eventually that evolved more into creating playful workplaces, and then I started to pull more from user experience design areas and product management, which I worked in the past. I actually don't have a people and culture background. And it started to flesh out a little more. And because I worked on user onboarding, I started to take a lot of concepts from that area, apply it to employee onboarding or anything with the user experience. I took a lot of areas from there and made use of it in the employee experience. So it's evolved over time and it's shifted. But I think now I feel pretty good in what my offerings are of more focusing on those key things in employee experience design. And again, when it comes with playful cultures, I see a lot of organizations kind of can get it wrong where they think all they really need is like, all right, well, we'll set aside time and basically quote unquote forced fun. And we just need a ping pong table and that will take care of everything. And that's not the case.
Yeah, it's not the case at all. I've known organizations who invest in the ping pong table or the foosball table or whatever it is, but nobody wants to play it. It's people are afraid to play because it may take away from work, and so even just defining what that actually means is a whole probably conversation we could have at another time, as well as employee experience. That whole journey of bringing on employees into an organization. And there's a lot of people who listening to this podcast who are founders of organizations or leading teams of people who may not have a fully structured or thought out onboarding experience. And I think that would be a fascinating podcast in the future, especially as we are onboarding nowadays, at least the company that I work at full time, onboarding 100% remotely. Even if they're living in the same city, we're not in the office. So how do we bring in that employee experience into onboarding, as well as those first couple of weeks that are so crucial to an employee? But what really interested me when we started talking about recording a podcast was this idea of play. And I'm sitting here in my home office, and I work for a full-time for an organization as the head of people and culture. And our leadership team, and we've talked even about, okay, so how are we still continuing to bring that fun into our culture? And so what are your thoughts, and how are companies shifting and still remaining connected with their teams in that fun and playful way?
Mm-hmm. So there's been in my mind, some strange kind of benefits that have come about as a result of this, COVID, where people have been forced to be working more remote. The main things is I've seen a lot of organizations really cutting back on the quote unquote forced fun activities. If you think about some organizations, they try and do all that, kind of leaping around, goofing around, Nerf gun fights, for a better lack of a stereotypical example, where I've talked with people who have seen videos where it's like you could clearly tell some people don't want to be there in those cases. And a lot of the thing, as I've been seeing with COVID, is leadership, management have been kind of like, well, I don't know, like what do you guys suggest? And instead of trying all these things without really getting a lot of employee insight, they've given the floor to a lot of employees to say, okay, like, what do you guys suggest? Is there something interesting you guys have? For example, some organizations I've talked with started to do, remote lunch and learns about, whoever wants to talk about any topic can be free to discuss, whether that's some programming language they discovered, their obsession with diamonds, or their knowledge about diamonds, or any kind of topic. That's been really good for getting organizations to kind of help discover more about other individuals, kind of more beyond the office. Some other ones I've been seeing, for example, some or employees have come forward and say, hey, you know what, I could teach yoga, I could teach a Zumba class, whatever, over Zoom, or even a cooking class. And, leadership, for the most part, from my team, be like, all right, like, let's try it and see what comes about. And then it's also, I think, being the case that it's remote. For those who don't want to attend, it's much easier to opt out. And it's not a case of, and you were talking earlier about like the ping pong and the foosball going unused, because sometimes at some organizations, there's that perception where if people spend too much time at it, that they're not working. And I worked at a place that was like that, where there was some issues around the foosball table where some felt others were spending too much time at it. To me, it didn't matter as long as they got their work done. But to others, it bugged them. So I think, the main thing really has been seeing that organizations have really been like, all right, well, we don't have, our office perks anymore. So what can we do about it? And, there's been a lot of really interesting resources online that have come up about like, all right, here's some, virtual things you could do, whether that's, virtual museum tours, Netflix party where you could all watch Netflix at once. Jackbox has gotten really popular. So it's been interesting to really see that pop up of employees having much more of a say in that kind of thing, as opposed to before when it was more driven on high by management.
Yeah, you're speaking a couple of things that are really ringing true to me. And And I feel that there's more and more need to have employee-driven initiatives versus looking to, senior leadership or the founders or people in culture to drive different initiatives. And so, if people are coming from that type of organization where it's been, looking for permission to do things versus, hey, let's just try it. Mm-hmm. How do we shift that culture? How do we shift that mindset?
That's not an easy thing to do. And there's that, I'm seeing in my mind right now, it's like the matrices where basically it's like things are important, not important, urgent, not urgent. So I see a lot of this over the last few months where a lot of these things like, people development or employee-led initiatives were seen as important, but not urgent. So organizations weren't really focused on that. And I've seen as a result that this worldwide event has definitely shifted that. So it's become a lot more urgent. So it's kind of a disappointing thing to say for a lot of organizations. It was like their hand was forced in this situation to really shift that culture because they had no real choice because of this worldwide pandemic. And, in an ideal world, they would have identified it earlier. And it's easier said than done, of course, to shift. If this was in the normal circumstances or whatever quote unquote normal is these days, for an organization to shift more towards that, employee-led directives or initiatives, because that's something that, some of these companies might have been around for years and years and years. And it's like, well, it's always come from high on management. It's always worked that way. So that's not a thing really where it's like, all right, we'll change one or two things here and overnight it's going to be different. There's a quote I always love to use in my presentations from Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. That's nothing is so great to the human mind as a great and sudden change.
I like that.
I think I got that right. But the thing is, some of these organizations unless their hand is forced, like to try and revamp things overnight's probably going to face a lot of resistance. So I always talk about like what's one small step that organizations could take to start adding in more employee directives or initiatives. And I think really at that point, like the easiest step is just start talking to people and seeing what they suggest. So in an ideal world, companies would not need a worldwide pandemic to have their hand, especially those that were pretty much all in office and more quote unquote traditional, to have their hand forced to make use of that. But I mean, that's been the realities these last several months, right? That as much as, I enjoy like trying to convince organizations to, it's like, well, there's some organizations I typically find with, for example, tech, who are a little more, they're more open to those kind of things. They have issues in other areas, but for example, I guess more traditional, say like maybe like law or government, they're a little more hesitant, and that's understandable. So there's no real easy answer for that change to come within. It's not something that happens overnight, unless you have a big situation like what's been happening these last 6 months or so.
With everybody, in especially small, medium, or large companies, people are busy, and people are, they're sitting in their home or sitting somewhere working away, not necessarily in that office anymore. Maybe you are. Maybe there's an office space, but you're the only one in that office space. So creating that culture of employee-driven initiatives, it sounds great. I like it. I as a team of one in the organization I'm part of, and I say that as a team of one, but it's there's a lot of support there. But initiatives come my way all the time, and I just have to say, go for it. Plan it, do it, see what happens, and really get those ideas off the ground. And would you say that we can put out calls for initiatives from different employees or from our employees, but then is it up to people in culture or managers to then implement, or is it anybody can then run with it?
That's a good question. I think it really depends. I mean, if it's like a small, and if it's a small initiative, it's like, hey, maybe people gather at, I don't know, let's say on Zoom at 3:00 to discuss, I don't know, like what books they've been reading recently. That's not something you overly need to get involved with. Maybe as it grows, you can be, but it's finding that right balance of, being there at a management level, giving them the support and showing like, hey, we got your back on this 100% to try out these things. But also you don't want to get too, what's the word I'm looking for? Try and get too micromanagey of it, right? And start saying, oh, you know what, we can't do this because we have to include this person, or, this isn't going to work for so-and-so for this individual. So it's finding that right balance of giving that support, of showing like, hey, you know what, go for it. Like I talked with one organization that struggled at first, but then they had, I think like a vice president who started doing Zoom cooking classes, and that kind of got the ball rolling of like, oh, you know what, it doesn't matter what position you are at the company. If you have an idea, let's roll with it and we'll do our best to support you. So yeah, finding that balance, giving them the support, but also not, trying to get too micromanagey, depending on what they do. I mean, if it's like a small little initiative, of course, let them have free reins better. If it gets something a little bit larger, then you might have to get a little more hands-on.
I like that example of a VP starting a Zoom cooking class, because it often takes the leadership to show that initiative as well, to almost give that unwritten permission to go and do something. Mm-hmm. And I think back to a culture report that came out here in British Columbia, a culture scan report that was produced by Spark Creations. One of the really driving factors of culture is it starts from the top. It starts at the leadership level. Mm-hmm. So if we're looking at a culture change, we often say, well, anybody can initiate a culture change, but often people in our organizations look for that unwritten permission. You know what I mean? Like, look at what is our leadership team doing? What is our management team doing? Is that what you see in organizations as well when you go in either to speak or to do some consulting with them?
Yeah. It's always from the top levels, and then sometimes, there's these cases of, it gets all the support, but then it comes from the top and then kind of gets lost somewhere in the middle, and that leads to disarray. That's more for larger organizations, but that's been one of these things for sure I've seen these last few months. Is I see a lot of leadership now, where I was mentioning earlier, the important but not urgent. I've seen for like anything like people development related, keeping a pulse on workers, employee well-being, mental health, stuff that of course is very important but wasn't urgent at the time. It's unfortunate that this large event in our world has caused it to be now seen as urgent and come to the forefront. But I guess if sometimes that's what it takes for leadership and management to acknowledge it and figure out ways to deal with it, that's the case. I wish it didn't need this kind of event to do so, but c'est la vie.
Yeah, it's the world we're in right now, and it has fortunately or unfortunately taken a bit of time for organizations to refocus on what truly matters when it comes to people. And it's not just a matter of here's your goals, go do it, but how do we also create that culture of connection, that culture of belonging, and not just offer perks as you've mentioned earlier. The beer on tap and the games tables, but how do we truly drive that culture of connection and fun and creativity? And maybe this is a good segue into what I mentioned in the intro, the 8 play personalities. Mm-hmm. You've talked about this in our conversations, but what are the 8 play personalities and how do they relate to work?
Sure. So the 8 play personalities, this comes from the work of Dr. Stuart Brown. He's pretty much the foremost expert in the world on all things play. Before we get into the 8 play personalities, just for some context, everyone can have multiple play personalities. It's not like Myers-Briggs where you fall under like certain ones, but you could have multiple ones. You probably gravitate towards a few of them. And they could change throughout your life. So maybe, you get married, you have kids, you retire, you start a new job, you move somewhere different. that play personalities of yours may change. There is one more thing about it. Oh, yes. So, and this is something, I guess, there's this misconceptions of play, not just in a leadership or organizational level, but also personal level, where what's play for one person is work for someone else. It's basically, the expression, one person's trash is another person's treasure. So on that note, the 8 play personalities are, there is the Joker, the Kinesthete, the Explorer, the Competitor, the Director, the Collector, the Artist/Creator, and the Storyteller. So those are the 8 player personalities. And so just for some examples, the Joker, that's, whether that's improv comedy, that's stand-up comedy, that's being goofy like a little kid. Number 2, I said, is Kinesthete. So that's, movement without like competitive things to it. I see this a lot in tech companies, or even the Vancouver area where we are, companies, when they're in the workplace, they'd have their in-office yoga, their meditation rooms. Explorer is traveling, learning new languages. I say like using lunch and learns is a really good way to drive that forward. 4 is the Competitor. So of all these 8, the ones I see most organizations use are, number 1 by far is the Competitor, and number 2 being the Kinesthete, and some of the other ones not so much. And of course, Competitor makes sense, right? Organizations are competitive by their very nature. Leaders tend to be competitive as a result. So that's why you end up a lot of these organizations who have, the foosball tables and the ping pong tables, beer o'clock Fridays, and, video games in the office, excuse me. And which is fine, but that's not like, for me, I don't gravitate towards that. And then again, there's like the director. So these are people like, whether that's literally directing movies or that's, gathering potlucks or gathering events together. And I remember very early on when I was talking about this, someone put their hand up in the room and was like, how could anyone ever see that as play? And about a quarter of the room did. So again, it goes to show that, what's work for one individual is play for someone else. Then there's also, the Collector. This is, anything from collecting hockey cards to one organization I did this talk at, they had a whole collection of old Apple products in the back, like pretty much all the old variations of iPods, iPhones, even the old iMacs. And then, artist/creator, that's, companies that run hackathons. That's a very common one. Or having, when we were in the office, like maybe having a guitar or like a keyboard to play on. Storyteller, of course, that's something more for people who are into books. Book clubs are an easy one to do. Some organizations will have like Dungeons and Dragons nights. That's another one, and I'm a big fan of that too. So there's all these variations that you could pull from these 8, and I guess probably in the show notes after I could provide a link, because there's much more detail I could go into about breaking those 8 down. But yeah, the main thing being that because we all have different personalities, when someone doesn't seem so keen to being involved in certain activities, it doesn't mean they're not a team player. It just means they probably don't gravitate towards that, that ping pong table or, the Nerf gun fights, all those, for better lack of term, cliche Silicon Valley playful offerings in offices.
Mm-hmm. I've just thinking of an image in my mind. Yeah. The Nerf guns and playing around, and I could see, and I've managed teams who gravitate towards that side of play, and there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. But I've also managed a team who really gravitated towards, I don't know the personality, the different personality or play personality, but really towards more of that artist side of things. They really wanted to draft things out and draw things out. Yeah. And so how would then organizations, especially we're all remote, we're all dispersed. Is this something that you've seen companies bring into onboarding and to really understand, okay, how do you, as an individual, what resonates most with you? Or is it, I'm curious how organizations can bring this into their teams and continue to build that engagement and that creativity.
Sure. Yeah, I think depending on the company size. So if it's like a smaller company and you're bringing in people slowly, it's much easier to find out early on that okay, this individual kind of prefers these kind of things. So we could suggest like, oh, if you want to do if something employee led, here's some things that you could do, or here's some things that we could offer to you. Again, it's trying to drive that, figuring out what their needs are. And, you mentioned there, like having a team that gravitated towards, mostly, kind of like like Nerf gun fights or whatnot, more of that extroverted, maybe more competitive nature. And again, that's fine. And I think that's the thing as you get larger as an organization, it's not true for everything, but, for example, like people typically in sales, like for example, are typically more extroverted and are probably more competitive by nature. Not always, but it's probably, that gives you an idea like, okay, if our sales team here, they're probably going to be more into those kind of activities. Or, right now, I guess like, well, maybe they want to play Jackbox or something, or some, video game online, or some kind of board game online, something competitive. But then, I guess, for example, again, this is a bit of stereotyping, but, software developers might be a little more, introverted, and might be, as I mentioned, hackathons, which are kind of more of artist/creator thing. Like, well, that's something they could do. Or, I worked in an organization where a bunch of them were into this card game, Magic the Gathering. And, that kind of just came about organically at the organization. I tried to join. It was, I didn't realize how much of a money sink that game could be. But anyways, yeah. Because that's the thing. It's like, well, it's easy to say if you have a small organization, but a larger one, it's like, well, you could probably have more of a general idea. Like you could kind of feel like breaking it down by department might have a better way about it. So it's like, if you do have a sales team, it's like, I'm not saying that everyone's going to be that way, but having something that's more that competitive nature is probably going to suit them. But you should always ask them. And that's always a thing of, the last thing I want organizations doing is, coming up with all these things they could do for all the play personalities, like locking themselves away and then throwing it out there and be like, all right, guys, enjoy it. It's more having that conversation with employees. And even in some cases, employees just, more or less want to do their work and well, I guess we're all home now, but do their work and then shut their laptop after. And that's totally fine as well. Like, if they need to blow off some steam, otherwise there's other options for them. So a lot of it again comes down to, teams will give you a better idea of people. Again, like it's the thing, like we could have multiple play personalities, but you will find if people gravitate towards maybe, certain positions that tend to be maybe more extroverted or people interaction, they might typically have similar play personalities. That's not a guarantee, but it is like a good framework or starting point.
It's thinking of even on the onboarding experience piece and potentially curating some questions in order to derive maybe a play personality on an onboarding questionnaire, and trying to see if anybody else in an organization should be, an onboarding buddy or that type of thing. There's ways you can do that, whether it's, your Excel-based onboarding or you've got an HRIS system and questions that you can ask. But also, I think of a lot of organizations use tools like Slack and setting up different channels on, I like to drink beer, so I'm going to join the beer channel, or I don't like beer, but I do like pets, so I'm going to join the pets channel. And
dogs are a huge one.
Yeah, exactly, right. Or adventure photos. I want to be hiking, every weekend, and so I want to meet up with or follow other people that are also involved in that adventure type thing. So there are ways that we can, as leaders in organizations, encourage that culture, but also as leaders not be a roadblock to create that type of culture. I think that's where I want to kind of get to as we kind of wrap up our conversation.
Sure, yeah.
And so for those who are listening, whether you're a people leader, you're leading a company, what could somebody start doing today in order to, hey, we're remote, we'll likely be remote for the next while. How do I bring play and creativity and engagement and fun and everything else into the organization without quote unquote forcing it?
Yeah, like kind of that one small step thing. It's really just talking to employees, like sending something out there, whether that's a survey, whether that's just having a one-on-one video call, like maybe in the Slack channel, be like suggestions for things we could do as fun. Like again, the last thing I think like a people team should be doing is kind of locking themselves away without getting outside input, but talking with employees and saying like, hey guys, like, because we're still going to be here a while. And of course, a lot of organizations where these last few months have tried different things or come up with different things as time has gone on. So now it's maybe a good time to kind of review and say like, as we've been away, like what's been working so far is keeping you engaged, or, keeping things fun, or is there new activities that you think we could do? I think a lot of it is just having those ongoing conversations. Like it doesn't need to be this big plan or anything. It's just picking up what works. And I know for a lot of people, they think, oh my God, like, am I going to ask? How many people am I going to need to ask? Is it like we send this out to hundreds of people, maybe at our organization? It's like, well, just start with 5 people. So there's a good rule in the user experience design called the rule of 5, where if you're testing some idea out, product out, service out, usually 5 users is more than enough to start identifying patterns of things that work and things that don't. And of course, if you can identify those patterns, then you could expand it more than 5 users. But even just picking 5 employees and just, I think it's less maybe about the specific activities, but more picking up maybe common language or common things that arise in patterns, that maybe it's like, oh, I wish we had more time together, or, I wish maybe we had more of a set time to do things, or maybe I wish we had more say in what things get done. So again, I think, the main thing is just starting to have these conversations with employees, whether it's a survey or Slack poll, Slack message, or, a call over Zoom with people. It's just kind of, getting that ball rolling. And that's always how I end my workshops or webinars. It's like, again, with that Mary Shelley quote I said of, nothing is more painful to the human mind than the great and sudden change. You don't need to revamp everything and be like, all right, tomorrow, everything's going to be different about how we engage, how we work. So it's just taking that small step. And to me, I suggest to people, it's like on this front, just go talk to people, seeing how they've been feeling these last few months as regards to, what we've been offering for fun and right now is remote, and what things have been working and where can we improve on it.
It sounds too easy, Paul. It sounds way too easy. What is it? Occam's razor? Is it like the best solution is typically the simplest one? Yeah,
I think that's what it is.
Right. It's often I find we try to over-engineer a solution that is really just as simple as, why don't we just ask a few people? Mm-hmm. Let's take off our headphones if that's how we're listening to this podcast, and go on Slack or Messenger or whatever, pick up the phone and ask a few people, and not just ask the question, are you engaged? Yes or no? But go deeper than that.
That tells you like next to nothing. You have to like dig in. And that's on another note, like I said, there's the rule of 5 for testing. There's always the 5 whys, which is someone gives you an answer to something. It's like, ask why to something in that answer, and then kind of keep digging. And maybe once you get down to 5 whys, you'll find that root cause.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you engaged? Okay. Well, why? What's keeping you engaged? Or no. Okay. So tell me more. What would you like to see more? I wish we had, I don't know, a book club. Okay. Well, what's holding you back from starting a book club? Well, I didn't know I had permission to start one. Well, I'm giving you permission to start one.
Yeah, and like, why did you not realize that? Or
yeah, exactly. What was the barrier for realizing that? And it's using that simple technique, a little bit of coaching, some coaching questions with what and how, and the 5 why technique for process improvement and root cause. Very simple. So there you go, guests, our listeners. You've got the 8 play personalities, and a basic understanding of what they are, as well as a real simple takeaway to go start asking our employees about, are you not are you engaged, yes or no, but do we have enough fun and creativity in the organization while we're over remote? And if the answer is no, then how do we build that in? And I think you've given us a bit of a framework there, Paul. So thanks for that.
No problem.
Yeah. And how do people find you?
Yeah. Best way is through my website, Playficient. So that's www.playficient.com. So it's combining the words proficient and play together. On there, and I guess probably in the show notes, we could add a link. I have a big, long blog post about the 8 play personalities. How to make use of them, why organizations tend not to make use of them. The benefits of doing them. On LinkedIn, I don't do a whole lot of Twitter. I find maybe I should step up my game more, but definitely on LinkedIn, I'm much more active. Paul Lopushinsky, again, it's a bit of a hard to find the last name, but again, it's probably be in the show notes. If you're ever on any Slack HR channels, I guess the big ones being, I guess there's like People Geeks, Hacking HR. I'm typically in those every once in a while, just seeing what people are saying. I might chime in here and there with either some thoughts or question prompts. So that's always, the best way to find me.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks for that, Paul. And for our listeners, if you like what you heard, anything's resonating with you, love for your comments when we in LinkedIn or direct, or find a way to get a hold of us at peoplemanagingpeople.com. Just always love to hear feedback and comments on the podcast. And so with that, thanks again, Paul. And to our listeners, we hope you have a great day.
Thanks for having me.